Welcome to the Critical Edges podcast. In this podcast, we explore critical edges that may seem distant and marginal at first glance, but which are in fact very much connected to and even interdependent with our global society and politics. In our podcast, we discuss with different scholars who have, one way or another, addressed critical edges critically. Bell Hooks argued that margins can become a, quote, site of resistance, a location of radical openness and possibility, unquote. But what are the dynamics that can create change in critical edges, and how could these dynamics create radical futures? In this episode, I'm talking to Dr. Şule Can, a socio-cultural anthropologist at Binghamton University's Centre for Middle East and North Africa Studies. Şule's research investigates displacement, borders, ethno-religious boundaries, disaster and cultural heritage, urban politics and anthropology of the Middle East. Much of her work has focused on her hometown, Antakya, a border city in Turkey's Hatay region, with its rich history and current complex dynamics. Şule's various research projects have explored gender and the politics of solidarity work and oral histories and memory in this border area. So it comes as no surprise that Şule's research considers several critical edges, social, political and geographical, in a very dynamic space. Şule describes herself as an activist researcher and is deeply engaged in Antakya's lively multicultural community. Since February 6, 2023, when devastating earthquakes hit southern Turkey and northwest Syria, killing at least 60,000 people and destroying much of Antakya, Şule's research has focused on grassroots activism movements that sprung up around the reconstruction efforts and which seek to ensure those efforts are inclusive, just, and preserve Antakya's unique, vibrant social and cultural fabric. So, without further ado, this is Katherine in the studio, and I warmly welcome Şule to this podcast episode to explore the dynamics of margins. Şule, thank you so much for being here with me today, and it's really a pleasure to have you with us. So, in many ways, your personal and academic journeys have been quite interlinked. Can you tell us about how you came to research? Can you describe your journey for us?
Thank you so much. Yes, of course, I would be happy to. First of all, thank you, Katie, for hosting me at this podcast. And it's quite exciting to join. And it's always a pleasure, right, to talk about, my own research and how I came to this level, to this particular research topic. So as you also described a little bit, I started this journey more of as an activist because I was always interested in, politics, especially in Turkey, mostly interested in kind of, human rights of the people who are more marginalized in Turkey and from different ethno-religious backgrounds. This was partly because of my background, of course, because I come from an ethno-religious community that is less known, in Turkey, but also I think in the world in general. My kind of academic research also started, thinking about the questions revolving around, assimilation and community building and it was more about ethnic and linguistic identity. So these questions kind of led me to study more kind of social cultural construction of communities in many ways. And also I was always interested in advocacy work, right? So I was always active in different civil society groups in many ways. And then I found room in anthropology, I would say, where I could actually do kind of public face of anthropological and ethnographic work. And then I could also kind of engage theoretically, right, in these academic spaces. When I started my PhD in the US at Binghamton University, State University of New York, I was thrilled to find an advisor who thinks about borders, writes about borders and boundaries in many ways. And then actually that kind of dissertation work helped me study thoroughly, right, in an ethnographic context on migration and displacement. And that coincides with 2011, where Syrian crisis broke out, and I started working with Syrian refugees, and there was that was another kind of crisis point for Antakya, as it is right now too, unfortunately. But I kind of started thinking about borders and boundaries and displacement more and more, and then that was my dissertation work, and that continued afterwards. So Antakya had a lot. It is my hometown, but it had a lot to do actually my academic journey.
So Antakya, it's a very dynamic place. I mean, everything that is happening there is quite dynamic and dramatic. What are the dynamics actually taking place in Antakya at the moment? And can you tell us a bit about what has shaped them?
I would definitely start with, Antakya as an ancient town. At the same time, we can talk about many different layers of histories, right? Many different aspects of identity, culture in many ways, right? And I do think that, Antakya is a very interesting place, a microcosm of this, symbolic, cultural, geographical factors, aspects in many ways, right? It's a border city, first of all. But at the same time, for the sake of kind of understanding more kind of modern construction of this urban margin, right, is probably, like post-Ottoman context. I would, definitely start how, after First World War, how Antakya's history has been shaped. So after the collapse of the Ottoman Empire, Antakya was actually Sancak. It is known as Lower Iskenderun in Arabic, which is Sancak of Iskenderun, and it was actually under the French mandate. So it was part of the French mandated Syria until 1939. So when Turkey was first established, actually, this province was not part of Turkey. So there was also a lot of claims over this territory, and different communities kind of, having different positions in terms of, supporting Turkey or Syria or the French, right? So it was never very linear, right? And history is never linear in that sense. But at the same time, that moment in history created certain circumstances where, there were multiplicity of identities and different ideologies kind of competing with each other, right? And that's also part of the story of, erasure of certain histories, certain communities in many ways, because in 1939, when the province was annexed by Turkey, Turkey claimed that the region is Turk and Turkish, and claimed kind of, that Turkish-speaking population was already there and dominating, and that kind of understanding of nation state in many ways, right, is like, if there are these Turkish-speaking communities, then it needs to be part of Turkey kind of claims. And also, of course, there were a lot of, agreements with the French colonial forces. In fact, what happened was, Turkey kind of designed the province in many ways, and it's the 1939 kind of was the start of erasure of Arabic language and Arab heritage of Antakya.
So was 1939 the time when Antakya and the Hatay region actually became a contested space, or was it contested before that as well?
I do think that it is, it was to some extent a contested space, yes. But after 1939, Syria blames Turkey, by kind of, annexing this territory. So Syria had claims, but Syria was under the French mandate until 1946. So 1939 is important because that's the time when the province joined Turkey, right? It became part of Turkey with the people in them, right? In there. So suddenly it was like, oh, we were part of another country and now we're part of Turkey. So of course they were all given citizenship and people continued kind of like as Turkish citizens, right? But then a lot of, for a lot of communities, it was a milestone because then now what, right now, how were they going to really exist and how were they going to continue? So it was interesting. And that's why there was a lot of migration, right, as well. So a lot of people left Antakya when Turkey annexed because some of them were, such as Armenians, some of them were concerned about their safety or if they were going to be welcomed or not was an issue, if there was going to be any kind of violence towards, for example, Christian minorities. So it has become, I would say, more contested because multiple states had claims on the territory, but also secondly, it has become contested because now there was the question of living together, how, these different identities, communities, and also under the shadow of this Turkification processes, what kind of, space was it going to be, right? That was what made it more contested than ever, I would say.
And so thinking about what is happening in Antakya today, or can you describe the dynamics that are happening there at the moment? I mean, we've fast forwarded several decades, almost a century since the annexation. We've had several significant and dramatic events. What's actually happening in Antakya right now?
Yes, I think there have been a lot of moments that change the dynamics and most of the time quite challenging actually for Antakya people. Obviously, people have been accommodated in Turkey, and also Antakya has become a very kind of special place where different ethnologist communities live together, and there is also kind of like unique urban, culture there where is more inclusive than other places, I would say, especially, in Turkey. Besides the metropolitan areas, at the peripheries, this is not something that you see. But also we know that border areas are always, mixed and vivid and very kind of the transition is always there and very dynamic within itself, right? And Antakya is such a place too, but also in 2011, for example, when the Syrian crisis broke out, it was an important moment because Syrian refugees mostly preferred or needed to stay in borderlands, and Antakya was one of the destinations for a lot of Syrian refugees. So after 2011, gradually, there were hundreds, thousands of refugees in Antakya. Today, we're not sure about the numbers, but right before the earthquake, we know that it was almost 400,000. So, and the province itself has, 1.6 million population. So we're really talking about a big community joining in Antakya. And some of them, for example, in my studies, I always observed that some of them actually wanted to stay in Antakya because of its Arab heritage, because of its, kind of similarity to, Damascus or Aleppo in Syria. And some people stayed there because, they always hoped that they would go back to Syria. And for some of them, it is the case today. But these dynamics kind of influenced how people engage with the city as well, right? So, and it showed once again that it is a border city that is always changing in its landscape and demographics and whatnot. For Antakya people, it was an interesting moment because, there was a lot of questions about refugee populations and, Turkey's Syria policy. So from time to time, there have been tensions, but still, again, I think Antakya showed its uniqueness in that sense, even though, I cannot say everybody was welcoming to refugees at all, but there weren't any major tensions, right? So today there is still, a significant refugee population, Syrian population in Antakya, and more recently, right, 2023, the earthquake kind of now is the main issue. And in the post-disaster context, the main question is what's going to happen, right? Because the city has been destroyed in many parts. And also, as a result of that, there has been a lot of displacement and dispossession.
So, what are the different groups that might be hoping to influence the city's future?
So there are many solidarity groups and grassroots organizations in Antakya, and of course, in post-disaster context, right, there have been a period where there was the relief and kind of humanitarian work, mostly, and we saw kind of a lot of national and international NGOs going to the area. But now, it's also last week it marked the second anniversary of the earthquake on, February 6th. And after 2 years right now, there's mostly local groups who actually work really, really hard to maintain a social cultural life, but also kind of with the recovery. I've been also part of these efforts, right? We are trying to build community centers. We're trying to also kind of voice the problems, the issues that exist in Antakya, right? From human rights violations to kind of seeking for justice, right, for the people who died. And we are also working hard to influence urban reconstruction processes in many ways, because it is very centralized and the kind of the decisions that are made are not involving any communities. So we are kind of voicing our all the efforts themselves are for community-led planning and community-led reconstruction in many ways, right? But also recovery itself has been very long because the conditions under which people live right now in Antakya are horrific, literally. And it's been 2 years and we still see little progress in kind of providing any relief or any kind of nice humane spaces for people to live in, right? They are in the camps and, almost 250,000 people are in these container cities. They call them container cities. They are literally camps, right? Including refugees, locals all over, right? And there is also like a very fast construction of these physical buildings. A lot of people, grassroots organizations and movements talk about social, cultural, heritage and how to kind of recover people themselves, right? And on the government side or on the reconstruction of the physical buildings, nobody actually cares about, they are just like trying to mass produce this apartments, buildings, and just like to accommodate people. But there is no holistic approach towards like how to make this, urban Antakya come to life again.
And so what are these grassroots solidarity movements actually doing to try and bring back that cultural fabric of Antakya?
So there are different groups. For example, one of them is Deprem Dayanışması, and I work with them very closely, earthquake solidarity groups. So what they do is they actually have multiple areas of work, right? They work with women, for example, to respond to their needs, and they work with children, and they also come up with a lot of projects in terms of memory and heritage. There's also a group, for example, I'm part of them as a writer. I contribute as well. There's a platform called Nahna. Nahna is an Arabic word for saying us. So Nahna is, for example, doing a lot of memory work, right? focusing on cities' memory spaces, for example, and how people remember, certain social and cultural spaces. There are many grassroots organizations that I cannot really list all of them. They are really working hard to preserve somehow the ancient town is almost completely destroyed, right? What they are trying to preserve is they're trying to kind of rebuild it to avoid the touristification and to kind of have that local soul and aspects and spirit to it.
That's quite a risk, actually, in Turkey. We've seen in other cities around Turkey that very important historical and cultural sites and cities actually become open to mass tourism.
Yes, we've seen this example also, I think, elsewhere too, right, even in Western contexts and even, right, we call this Disneylandification at the same time, right, where actually a lot of these places, in Diyarbakir, in Sur, for example, in Turkey too, and other, major cities, city affected by the conflict in Turkey. And in a lot of them, what we see is the rebuilding and reconstruction is based on a touristic gaze instead of understanding locals' needs and actually aspects of heritage, right? So in that sense, kind of preservation of cultural heritage has become a very redundant and very kind of straightforward thing where they're like, oh, we're going to just rebuild as it is, but for whom? And you're displacing whom, dispossessing whom? Who's going to own it, right? So these kind of questions are quite important because we as anthropologists ask them a little more. I don't know if we can influence any policies or if we are, really helping in any way. But I'm hoping that at least kind of raising these questions are creating some kind of, resistance to this kind of imposition, right? And we've seen that in gentrification all the time, right? Urban anthropologists know them very well. So it is an issue in many ways. Recently, I have been working with ASF UK, Architecture Sans Frontières, based in the UK, Architecture Without Borders, and we also collaborate with kind of local groups and communities and grassroots organizations. Our motto is what makes Antakya is the people. So it is more kind of we are inviting everybody to think about people and their heritage, in an intangible form or other forms, rather than just understanding physical structures as the point of reconstruction. So that's why I think a lot of grassroots organizations are and artists and art groups, they also work hard for the recovery. They're trying to understand how kind of like artistic production and reproductions can help with children, for example. And there are different union groups working, hard to improve the conditions in education and in health. There are ecology groups working for this environmental disaster too, because earthquake happened, but what's happening right now is an ecological disaster. I mean, the whole city is literally under the kind of clouds of dust, and there are really, emerging health problems there. So what I'm trying to say is all these movements kind of merge under the kind of contributing to or kind of helping the city heal better, right? And also to resist any reconstruction policies that are centralized, that ignore Antakya's uniqueness, I would say.
It would be interesting to consider if these grassroots movements are actually able to have any influence and impact on the so-called centres. You've mentioned many different groups from artists, environmentalists. All of these people and movements come from quite marginal areas. I mean, not only geographically in this context as well. Is there the potential for these grassroots movements coming from this very critical edge to have any influence on the centres, so on national policies?
That's a hard question to answer. It's because it's hard to understand the impact immediately, right? But I do think that there is a lot of merit in what they are doing. And first of all, I think the resilience is just in itself, right? Is an amazing example of how people can fight to decide the fate of their own cities and kind of resist in many ways after such a devastating disaster. But the second thing is that at the policy level, I think it is really difficult to influence the policies in Turkey because most of the time these decisions are just implemented, and in many ways, they kind of ignore, as I said, the local authorities in many ways, right? Whether they are municipalities or civil society groups, doesn't matter. They're usually dismissed in this efforts. But that being said, I think there are many examples where people, demonstrated and really came against certain decisions, and they were withdrawn. So there was, a lot of cases where people won actually, and so it does work in many ways, the work that we have done. But at the same time, I think the impact on policy is less of a concern for some grassroots organizations because the recovery becomes a priority here, right? And the state itself is not going to initiate these kind of efforts, right, for communities and for community healing. So that's what these organizations mostly do, and I would say quite successfully in many ways.
Can you tell us about your research into the reconstruction efforts happening in Antakya at the moment and into these grassroots movements?
It's hard to summarize because I have two lines of work that I am involved right now, right? So one is something that I do here at Binghamton, which is Mapping February 6 in Antakya. It's a digital memorial. And the second one is the work that we started with a group of scholars, including anthropologists, historians, and artists, to build a digital archive of Antakya based on social, cultural, and historical memory of the city. The first one, I will talk about that a little bit because that's something that I hope to kind of launch and announce in May 2025, and we have been really working diligently with a project team here at Binghamton right now. We came up with this idea when we were discussing with a friend of mine based in New York City, Pınar Yeşiloğlu. She's from Antakya as well, and we were talking about the statistics, the numbers of people who died in the earthquake, right? As you also announced in the introduction, the official number that was uttered by the state officials, state agents, were 53,000. And in Antakya, a lot of people and, disaster survivors, including myself, we all claim that this number doesn't represent the truth, right? It is way more than 53. We're not talking about Hatay only, right? The province of Hatay or Antakya only. They are talking about 53,000 in 11 cities. And people in Antakya believe that it is over 50,000 in Antakya alone, right? So
oh my God.
It has, people claim that. And there are a lot of claims here and there, but there are also a lot of, there's a kind of lack of, information in terms of how we can, conclude the numbers. So that was part of the conversation. The reason why I'm talking about this is because it will make more sense when I talk about what we are doing actually with Mapping February 6. And the second thing is that we always wanted kind of a digital platform where people could share their memories of the people. So there are actually different platforms, like Nehna, for example, started this platform about sharing memories of the city, right? It is through crowdsourcing, right? So people actually contribute to, these memories, and it's a kind of interactive website. And that's wonderful. But we were talking about how about people that we lost in the earthquake? If there was a platform where an intimate space, but digital, right? Where people just like share whatever they want to share about people they lost in the earthquake. So we kind of combined this conversation into one digital space, and now we're building a website where there will be mapping of the buildings that collapsed in February 6th, and showing how many people, approximately, we cannot know for sure, but approximately the number of people who died in those buildings. And if possible, if we can get the information, the list of people who died in those buildings. So we are pinpointing the buildings by showing the kind of also how many people died in those buildings. But also we wanted to create this digital memorial within the same, website, if possible, for people to be able to share their memories about the lost, loved ones. It is going to be based on, of course, people's, willingness to share if they want to only. But it is a good opportunity for us to think about kind of digital humanities and understanding actually the work that we do in a critical perspective, but where also we can contribute to recovery and healing in many ways, right? So in that sense, I have collected some data, and whenever I'm in Antakya, there are people who I know who died, right, and including friends, relatives, and here and there neighbors. So that in that sense, it is emotionally heavy, and it is a challenging one, absolutely. But I think now, I mean, 2 years after this disaster, I felt like, okay, we need to make it happen, right? I think it was just there as an idea, but I couldn't start, doing it. But now we're at a place where we can actually, understand how mourning and remembering, commemorating those we lost is part of that recovery.
I'm so sorry again for everyone that you lost, and just for this horrible, horrible tragedy. You're in a very unique position. You're doing research on this topic, on this community, but you're also an active part of the research. You're also an active participant of the research too. It's something that you've actually described in your earlier work before the earthquake. But can you talk a little bit about what it is like to be in this active researcher position?
Yeah, absolutely. And that's a thank you for asking this, because that's an important part of understanding what anthropology does at the same time, and how we can see these edges that we describe on ourselves too, right? So as a researcher, we always ask the question is, right, who is the researcher and who is the researched, right? Who are we really talking to? What are we really looking at? What is our position? And that kind of reflexivity has always been part of anthropology specifically, but also I think more recently in social sciences. We keep talking about this different methodologies, different locations for self as a researcher, right? And for me, it has always been part of the conversation, because I'm a native anthropologist. I'm from Antakya. I grew up there, and I chose to study the border area and Turkish-Syrian border, and history of it, and the displacement more recently. So for me, it is also delving into my own very existence. It is also about my city, my people, and I in a place where I advocate for those right, and voicing concerns. So it brings some kind of alienation at times, and it brings a level of familiarity and intimacy that nobody else has. A very famous now anthropologist, Ghassan Haj, calls this ethnographic vacillation. So you are always constantly negotiating and oscillating between two forms of beings, right? You are as a native self and politically involved researcher. You're at one place at times, and then at another you're just like looking from outside as a stranger, right, to a very familiar space. So, and you will always be in these different dilemmas and conflicts. Once you embrace that, I think then you are okay with making progress and whatever that might mean. But I think in a lot of studies we ignored for so many decades, right? In social sciences, we ignored this kind of perspective where the researcher herself is part of that methodology, and it doesn't have to be only autoethnography, right? That's not what I'm doing at all. For example, I never wrote a monograph on autoethnography, right? But the history of the city is history of the self as well. So what do you say in that kind of aspect, right? How do you understand that? Or when you look at the history of the border itself, how do you actually theorize in many ways, right, yourself as kind of this complex, right, product of the borders or boundaries or identities. So in many ways, it is really a blend of many ideas that was also actually that were introduced by the border scholars, all right, more in the last decade. So, yeah.
In these very politicized environments, I mean, can a researcher enter this environment as someone neutral anyway?
I think as an anthropologist, is kind of the answer is within the question itself, because I don't know if what we can say about neutrality in this context, for example, that I work in, because when you're trying to advocate for people, right, and for the dispossessed, for the displaced, you are taking a side, right, in this line of activist research. And this has been the case in many contexts, right? I mean, how are you not going to take a side when you are working with Native Americans in the US, right, in North America, right, let's say, and or in many kind of, if you are working, I don't know, any border area, really, any contested spaces, right? So, so in that sense, I think what we are sometimes confusing neutrality with is that the reliability of the data that we have, right? And also kind of taking sides, right, in terms of your interlocutors or the research that you're putting out. These are not mutually exclusive. I mean, your data can be very reliable, and you can kind of objectively, you can try to kind of objectively put that out there, right? But at the same time, it doesn't, your positionality and your political involvement and your voicing opinions for the people who are, marginalized doesn't negate, right, the value of your research. So in that way, I think the way we understand social scientific research, but more importantly, ethnographic research, is beyond this, discussion of neutrality per se.
So, to a certain extent, your research is very much focused on the future, like the future of Antakya. What can it become? And your research is very much interlinked with the reconstruction efforts as well. So how do you see research as having the ability to contribute to the reconstruction of Antakya?
Um, I think there are multiple layers of contribution here through all kinds of research that's been kind of going on, right? Not only my work, obviously, that's been going on and in Antakya. So one is definitely documenting, right, this historical moment of destruction and the efforts for preservation and understanding also the kind of both symbolic and civilian ordinary heritage that we have, whether it is architecture, architectural, or whether it is kind of social, cultural, and more importantly, political memory of Antakya. Even in the second line of work that I had mentioned before, is a big part of it is kind of history of this political memory that's being erased. Mostly because of the earthquake and then the post-disaster reconstruction, right? So that's why the research that we do has a lot of potential to understand the history and this kind of urban structure, right, and heritage before the earthquake. So in that sense, I think it is already contributing a lot to the future generations, right? But at the same time, I think the future is about all these actors who stay behind and fight for the future of the city, right? So in that sense, I think for Antakya people, belonging is a very important part of their urban identity, and it's kind of signified with this motto right now, with the slogan of ما رحنا ننتهون, which is an Arabic word saying that we didn't go anywhere, we're still here. And that's special, yes, in many ways. And I think as long as in our research we realize that, we can always think about ways of helping Antakya people and helping them, also voice their concerns, right, about not only about current living conditions but also future. So it's a very dynamic space, just like all contested spaces. But some things, my advisor, my dissertation advisor would always say, it's just some things happened, and wrote about this many times. Some things only happen in these border areas, in these border cities, right? So yes, some things happen only there, and we need to see also unique responses, right, local responses to that.
So what do you think is the future of these very unique border areas, these contested spaces, not only Antakya, Hatay, but around the world?
I think we see today globally that it's becoming more and more difficult to voice, our opinions on critical edges, and we are under the pressure of kind of the changing borders and kind of forced migration in many ways. So there are a lot of examples today that we look at, and those contested spaces continue to be contested, from Lebanon to Israel, Palestine, to Syria, right, to Turkish-Syrian borderlands in general, right, and to Antakya. So in many ways, I think there is still an issue of historical events or aspects impact today the present conditions, and then I suspect that it will be part of the future as well, right? Especially in this context, right? We talk about many places in the Middle East. They are still, unfortunately, under the pressure of forced displacement and annexation, and in one way or another, even colonization, right? So in that sense, it's kind of the forms are changing, but the questions regarding sovereignty, regarding freedom of of movement, still there, and it will be there in the future. So future of critical edges will always come back to issues of displacement, because of the global order today, because of the kind of capitalist nation state order that we live in. So I don't want to sound too dark about, the what future holds for critical edges. But at the same time, it is to some extent, unfortunately, a kind of repetition of this historical violence. However, as we all know, human agency is there. That's very dynamic, and that can actually intervene into this kind of darkness and this kind of determination, I guess. Solidarity is the key part where we see emerging more and more in these critical edges, right? So what happens, for example, in the context of Palestine, what happens in the context of Antakya is that they are still standing because of the solidarity movements and because they don't give up, right? In many ways, I think that is going to be the case in the US, as we will see in the next 4 years how this is going to unfold. But in many ways, I think people now know that there is no easy way out. And if we want to envision a future together where we can actually build peace somehow, then it is on us, and people need to resist and fight, and there is no other way, right?
Thank you for listening to the Critical Edges podcast. We are Hanna Laako, Vadim Romashov, Eleonora Karttunen, and Katherine Hall, researchers at the University of Eastern Finland who explore and inhabit many critical edges.
This podcast is made possible by the Kone Foundation and the Borders, Mobilities and Culture Encounters research community of the University of Eastern Finland.